The penthouse floor of Ashford and Merritt Financial Group in downtown Seattle did not belong to the partners. Everyone in the building knew it. The associates whispered about it in the elevator. The paralegals avoided the North Corridor after 7 p.m. The cleaning crew had learned, the hard way, to finish the 42nd floor before 6 and never return. Because after 6, that floor belonged to someone else entirely. Mara Ellison learned this on her first day. She was 26, freshly licensed as a certified forensic accountant, and desperate enough to take a contract position that paid twice the market rate with no explanation for why. She had $60,000 in student loans, a studio apartment in Capitol Hill with a radiator that screamed every night, and a mother in Phoenix whose medical bills had stopped being manageable 6 months ago. Mara had not grown up with options. She had grown up with spreadsheets, with her father's accounting textbooks dog-eared on the kitchen table, with the quiet, stubborn belief that numbers never lied even when people did. That was what made her good at her job. That was also what was about to get her into serious trouble. Ashford and Merritt had brought her in to audit the estate trust of one Hargrove family, a 3-generation wealth portfolio worth somewhere north of $400 million. The official story was routine quarterly review. The unofficial story, the one Mara pieced together from the tension in the senior partner's jaw when he handed her the access credentials, was something else. She set up at a desk on the 38th floor. She was given a laptop, a badge with limited access, and a contact name, Mr. Stellan Voss, head of private client services. She would later understand that Stellan Voss was not just a contact name. He was a warning. The Hargrove Trust had been established in 1987 by a man named Edmund Hargrove, who had made his fortune in Pacific Northwest timber and had the moral flexibility that tended to accompany that particular industry during that particular era. Edmund had been dead for 11 years. His son, Cormac Hargrove, now ran what remained of the family's legitimate holdings: 3 hotels, a development company, and a charitable foundation that held galas twice a year, and accomplished very little else. What Cormac also ran, though this did not appear in any filing Mara was authorized to see, was a network of private arrangements that moved money across shell accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and a particularly creative series of Delaware LLCs with names like Blue Meridian Holdings and Crestfall Asset Management. Mara did not know this yet. She only knew what the numbers in front of her were telling her, and they were telling her something was wrong. It started small. A disbursement of $47,000 flagged as property maintenance on a property the trust no longer owned. A vendor payment to a landscaping company in a city where the trust held no real estate. Charitable contributions to a foundation that, when Mara searched the IRS database on her lunch break, had been dissolved 3 years ago. She made notes. She flagged the entries with yellow in her working spreadsheet, the private one on her personal laptop that she'd kept password protected and disconnected from the firm's server. She did not tell anyone yet. That was the thing people never understood about forensic accounting, the instinct to go quiet when you found something. Not because you were protecting yourself, though that was part of it, but because the moment you spoke, the numbers changed. The moment someone knew you were looking, the trail went cold. Mara had learned that in her graduate program from a professor who had spent 15 years at the FBI before burning out and turning to academia. He had told her class, "The first person you should tell when you find fraud is nobody. Find out what you're looking at first. Then find out who put it there." She spent 2 weeks finding out what she was looking at. By the end of week 2, the yellow in her spreadsheet had become a forest. 47,000 here, 112,000 there. Recurring transfers, disguised as management fees to a company whose registered agent was a P.O. box in Nevada. Over the preceding 4 years, the pattern was consistent and precise, never enough in a single transaction to trigger automatic reporting thresholds, always distributed across enough line items to look like noise. But Mara had been staring at numbers since she was 12 years old, and noise did not have rhythm. This did. Someone who understood accounting very well had done this deliberately and with patience. She estimated the total extraction at somewhere between $6 and $9 million. Then she found the beneficiary accounts, and she revised that estimate upward significantly. The trust had 3 named beneficiaries besides the charitable arm: Cormac Hargrove, his daughter Petra Hargrove, and a minor child identified only as HLH in the original trust documents. Cormac's distributions were normal, scheduled, proportionate, properly documented. Petra's were normal too, but HLH distributions had been quietly suspended 18 months ago. Not eliminated, suspended, as though someone had reached into the system and pressed pause, and then redirected the equivalent amounts through the property maintenance line and the defunct foundation and the Nevada P.O. box. Someone was stealing from a child. Mara sat very still at her desk for a long time after she understood that. She had seen Mr. Voss twice in the 3 weeks she'd been at the firm. Once in the elevator, where he had looked at her badge, then at her face, with the particular kind of assessment that made her feel like a number being evaluated. Not threatening, exactly, but precise in a way that was its own kind of unsettling. Once in the lobby, where he had been speaking in low tones on his phone and had stopped when she walked past, which might have meant nothing, and probably meant something. Stellan Voss was not what she had expected from the title Head of Private Client Services. He was in his late 30s, with the kind of stillness that came from either extensive practice or extensive threat. His suits were not the showy kind. His watch was expensive, but not ostentatious. He moved through the office the way people moved through spaces they owned without needing to announce it. The word the paralegals used when they whispered was connected. Mara had taken this to mean well-networked in the financial sense. She was still, at that point, operating on the assumption that whatever was happening with the Hargrove Trust was a sophisticated but ultimately conventional embezzlement scheme, the kind that got resolved through regulators and restitution agreements and careful legal maneuvering. She was wrong about that. She found out how wrong on a Thursday evening at 6:40, when she stayed late to cross-reference the Nevada LLC's registered agent against other Ashford and Merritt client files, a search she was not technically authorized to run, which was why she was doing it at 6:40 when the floor was empty. The registered agent appeared in 4 other client files. 2 were straightforward holding companies. 1 was a real estate investment vehicle, and 1 was a trust established for the benefit of a minor child, active, with a recent distribution record, distributions that, unlike HLH's, were still flowing. The name on that trust was Soren Voss. Mara stared at it for a long time. Then she heard the elevator open. She closed the unauthorized search window and pulled up her approved working file with a speed born of pure reflexive fear, and she was staring at a vendor reconciliation when footsteps stopped outside the glass partition of her temporary office. Stellan Voss stood in the doorway. He was still in his suit jacket. He was looking at her with an expression she could not read. "Working late," he said. It was not a question. "The trust documents have a few vendor coding inconsistencies," Mara said. Her voice was steady. She had not known until that moment that her voice could be that steady. "I wanted to get ahead of them before the preliminary report." He looked at her screen. He looked at her. Then he said, "The preliminary report isn't due until the 15th. "I know," she said. "I like to be early." A beat. Then he said, "Go home, Ms. Ellison. The building's security protocol locks the contractor floors at 7. "Of course," she said. "I was just finishing up." He nodded once and left. She heard the elevator again. She did not move for 4 minutes. Then she saved her working file to her personal encrypted drive, cleared the browsing history on the firm's laptop, packed her bag and walked out. She did not take the elevator. She took the stairs all the way down 42 floors, and she did not feel any of it. She did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her personal laptop and the notes she had made longhand in a notebook she kept in her bag. Old habit, her professor's advice, keep a paper trail that can't be remotely wiped, and she thought very carefully. The child, Soren Voss, a trust with a recent active distribution record, and HLH, whose distributions had stopped 18 months ago, with the money being quietly routed elsewhere. Mara pulled up what she could find on public record. Stellan Voss had one known family connection in Washington state. A child, Soren, listed as dependent on a property tax filing in Medina 3 years ago. No mother listed on any public record she could access. She found a brief mention in a society column from 5 years back, a charity gala for Seattle Children's Hospital, where Stellan Voss had appeared alongside a woman identified as Dr. Petra Hargrove. Mara read that sentence 3 times. Petra Hargrove, named beneficiary of the trust. She pulled up the trust document again. HLH. Hargrove. Last name initial, first initial H. She went back to the original 1987 trust and its subsequent amendments. The minor beneficiary had been added by amendment 17 years ago. 17 years ago, which would make the child currently 17 years old. HLH was almost an adult. 18 months from now, HLH would reach the distribution trigger age in the trust, 25, and the full accumulated value of that beneficiary's share would transfer automatically, unless, in the meantime, it had been systematically redirected. Unless someone needed 4 more years' worth of continued extraction to make sure there was nothing left to transfer. Mara sat back in her chair and pressed her palms flat against the table. She was not looking at a corporate embezzlement scheme. She was looking at a family member stealing the inheritance of a child, possibly their own, possibly with the involvement of the child's father, who sat on the 42nd floor and had looked at her last night with eyes like a controlled detonation. She needed a lawyer. She needed, more specifically, a lawyer who was not employed by Ashford and Merritt Financial Group. She called her former professor at 7 in the morning. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How much documentation do you have?" "Enough," she said. "Enough to reconstruct if they lock you out of the system. Everything important is already off their network." "Good." He paused. "Mara, I need you to hear me when I say this. The name Voss, in connection with the Hargrove family, means something in this city. I don't know the specifics, but I know the shape. Be careful about who else you tell before you understand what you're dealing with." "I know," she said. "Do you?" He said, "Because this isn't a textbook scenario." She knew. She had already figured out, somewhere in the 6 hours since she'd gotten home, that she needed to approach this differently than a normal fraud referral. Normal fraud referrals assumed that the regulatory process worked cleanly and that the people involved didn't have mechanisms for making problems disappear. Mara had no particular evidence yet that Stellan Voss had those mechanisms. She had, however, looked him up at 2 in the morning and found that 3 separate regulatory complaints connected to Ashford and Merritt in the last decade had been closed without action and expunged from public record. That was either remarkable good fortune or something else. She went into the office at her normal time. She behaved normally. She fixed 3 of the flagged vendor coding inconsistencies in her working file, the real ones, and documented them properly. She answered 2 emails. She ate her lunch at her desk. At 2 in the afternoon, Stellan Voss's assistant called her extension and told her that Mr. Voss wanted to meet with her at 4 to discuss the preliminary report scope. Mara said that would be fine. She spent the next 90 minutes making a second encrypted copy of everything and emailing it to a personal address she had created at 2 a.m. from a device that had never connected to the firm's network. She labeled the email Grandma's Recipe Backup and sent it to herself. Then she went to the meeting. His office was what she had expected and also not, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the sound. Clean lines, nothing personal visible except a single photograph on the credenza behind his desk, angled away from visitors. She did not let herself look at it directly, but in her peripheral vision she could see it was a child, young, maybe 6 or 7 in the photo, which would date it to roughly 10 years ago. "I appreciate you making time," he said, which was a strange thing to say to someone he had summoned. "Of course," she said. "I want to talk about the scope of the audit." He settled back in his chair with the easy authority of someone who had never had a meeting go wrong. "There's been some discussion at the partner level about narrowing the focus to the current fiscal year rather than the full 4-year look-back. That would be unusual for an estate trust review, Mara said. It would be efficient, he said. The 4-year look-back generates a significant documentation burden, and the family is interested in completing this review on a reasonable timeline. Mara looked at him. The documentation burden is actually fairly manageable, she said. I'm nearly through it. Something shifted in his expression, small, barely a fraction, but she had been trained to read small shifts in data, and this registered. How far through, he said. Substantially, she said. The vendor reconciliation is almost complete. I should have a preliminary by the 12th ahead of schedule. He looked at her for 3 seconds without speaking. Then he said, That's impressive work. Thank you. I'd like to review it before it goes to the partners. That's not standard protocol, she said. The preliminary goes directly to the engagement partner. In this case, he said, the family has requested a courtesy review. I'd want that request in writing from the engagement partner, she said, just to protect everyone's documentation. Another pause. This one longer. Of course, he said finally, I'll have it sent over. She knew it would not be sent over. She also knew that the conversation had just told her something important. He already knew, or strongly suspected, what she had found, and he was trying to get his hands on her work before anyone else saw it. She stood up. I'll keep you updated on the timeline, she said. I appreciate the clarity on scope. I'll note the conversation in my working file, just for the record. His eyes moved to her face. For the record. Standard practice, she said pleasantly, and left. She took the stairs again. She spent the evening sitting with everything she had and making a decision. The decision was not about whether to report. She had always been going to report. That part was not a choice, it was just what she was. What she had to decide was the mechanism and the timing, because the mechanism and the timing were going to determine whether the report resulted in accountability or in her working file disappearing and her contract being terminated and $6 million continuing to flow through a Nevada P.O. box while a child's inheritance evaporated. She did not have a family to protect her. She did not have powerful friends. What she had was a paper trail that existed in 3 separate encrypted locations, a phone number for the IRS whistleblower office that she had saved in her contacts under her mother's name, and a particular quality of stubbornness that had gotten her through graduate school on scholarships and part-time jobs, and the sustained refusal to accept that she didn't belong in rooms like the ones she was now sitting in. She thought about the child, HLH. 17 years old, somewhere, with no idea that someone had been quietly draining what was meant for them. She thought about Soren Voss, 6 or 7 years old, in a photograph in his father's office. She had no evidence yet that Stellan Voss knew about the diversion, only that the registered agent connected his son's trust to the same network being used to drain HLH's share. That was a different thing from guilt, and she was careful about the difference. But she was also not naive. At 9 o'clock she made the call. Not to the IRS, not yet. To a forensic accounting colleague who worked for the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division, someone she had met at a conference in Portland and whose personal cell she had kept, the way she kept a lot of things, because she believed in the value of resources held quietly until the right moment. She explained the situation with precision and without drama. Her colleague listened. At the end, she said, I need this to move fast. I don't think I have a lot of time before someone tries to narrow what I have access to. Her colleague said, Can you get me the documentation tonight? Mara said yes. She sent everything. All 3 backup locations, all the working notes, the timeline of transactions, the registered agent cross-reference, the trust documents and their amendment history, the beneficiary suspension, the photograph she had taken of her own handwritten notes with her phone. She sent it all, and then she sat with the silence of her apartment and the sound of the radiator, which screamed until around 2 in the morning, and then went quiet, and she thought about her father's accounting textbooks on the kitchen table, and how he had always said that numbers were the one thing you could count on to tell the truth eventually. He had meant it as comfort. She had understood it, young, as a kind of responsibility. She went to sleep. She had an early morning. The state AG's Financial Crimes Division moved with a speed that surprised her, and she suspected surprised Stellenbosch considerably more. They came on a Tuesday, 12 days after her call. Mara was at her desk when it happened, deliberately, because she had agreed with her contact that her continued normal presence in the office was important to the integrity of the process. She heard the commotion from the corridor and kept her eyes on her screen and her hands on her keyboard, though she had not typed anything coherent in 40 minutes. 2 investigators and a forensic team. Engagement partner first, a brief, very quiet conversation in the glass-walled conference room that lasted 9 minutes. Then a longer, less quiet conversation from behind the closed door of Stellenbosch's office that she could not hear but felt in some atmospheric way through the entire floor. Cormac Hargrove, she learned later, had been the primary architect. He had been extracting from HLH's beneficiary share for 4 years. The child was the product of his late brother's relationship, a branch of the family that Cormac had, through various legal mechanisms over the years, attempted to minimize. The trust amendment had been forced by the family's original estate attorney, who had died 2 years ago and whose death had apparently signaled to Cormac that the obligation had also died. He had been wrong about that. Stellenbosch's role was more complicated. He had known. He had not, as far as the investigation ultimately determined, been the one to design or initiate the scheme. But he had known, and he had protected Cormac's access to the firm's infrastructure, and he had been present in the meeting with Mara because he had recognized, faster than she had realized, that she was close to finding it. The photograph in his office was of Soren and a girl she had not seen in the frame. She found this out later too. His daughter by a different relationship, 12 years old, who received distributions from the same registered agent network. Whether Stellan had understood or simply not asked what he already knew, that question did not have a clean answer, and the investigation reflected that. Mara was not the one responsible for what happened to Stellenbosch. She had given the investigators what she found. The rest was theirs. HLH was a girl named Harriet Louise Hargrove. She was 17, lived with her mother in Olympia, and had been told by a family attorney when she was 14 that there was a trust in her name but that it was complicated and probably not worth expecting much from. Mara never met her. She heard about her through her AG contact in the dry language of case notes. Beneficiary notified, trust administration transferred to court oversight, recovery proceedings initiated. 41 days after the investigators came to the 42nd floor, Mara's contract was terminated by mutual agreement, which was the polite way of saying that Ashford and Merritt was unwilling to continue employing someone whose existence reminded everyone of what had happened, and Mara was unwilling to pretend that was not what she was. She had known that part was coming. She had saved for it. She had her documentation, her reference from her professor, and the quiet professional knowledge that the AG's office had noted her cooperation in formal language that could be used in future applications. On her last day, she packed her personal items into a canvas bag and took the elevator down, all 42 floors, no stairs this time. In the lobby, she stopped at the security desk to turn in her badge. The guard, a man she had nodded to every morning for 2 months, slid the badge into the reader and said, "Have a good one." She had found what was hidden in the numbers. She had understood who was supposed to receive what and who had decided to take it for themselves, and why that was not something she could look away from. She had done it with no power and no backup, except the stubborn arithmetic of right and wrong, which did not care about 42nd floors or Nevada P.O. boxes, or the kind of names that made paralegals whisper. Harriet Hargrove would turn 18 in 7 months. The recovery proceedings, her contact had told her, were going well. Mara walked out into the grey Seattle morning, turned up her collar against the October drizzle, and went to look for what came next.